Hi, thank you all so much for joining us today for works by Ysaÿe, but not the rather famous solo sonatas for violin, but lesser known works that I think are really worth getting to know. The main piece in the program today will be Chant, and we'll play it later, but we thought we would start with a sort of light opener. This is his Mazurka, Dans le lointain, in the distance. Mazurka, Dans le lointain by Ysaÿe. And now, before we play Chant, a short talk with Ray Iwazumi, who is really one of the greatest expert on Ysaÿe in the world today, I think. Both from the standpoint of a performer, he recorded all six solo sonatas, and he also edited and looked at manuscripts for Juilliard and for Henle of Ysaÿe's sonatas and also other works, so he really knows his stuff. So I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. Okay, and thank you so much to Ray Iwazumi, who is joining us now from where?
From New York. I'm in Arsley, New York. It's a little bit north of the city in Westchester County.
Okay, but it doesn't look like it, at least from the background.
That's right.
That you chose.
So I booked a flight and I went to Brno. So this is actually a photo from 10 years ago when I was actually spending quite a number of days at the Liège Conservatory Library, because the Liège Conservatory actually has a large number of Ysaÿe manuscripts and materials. Actually, in Belgium, the bulk of the manuscripts, like the music manuscripts, are in Liège. Like Brussels has some too, but the bulk of them are here in Liège. And in front of the conservatory, there's this bust of Ysaÿe, right? And I was, just for today, I was looking through my archives. It's like, oh, this is perfect. So this is from, I think it's like March 2010. It's like, yeah.
It's fantastic. It's so fitting. Yeah, thank you for
sure. Yeah.
for sharing with us. I wanted to start by asking about the piece that I just played, the first, actually, Mazurka by Ysaÿe, and what struck me right away was his choice to write a Mazurka for violin and piano, and especially a Mazurka is such a symbol of national Polish music, and Ysaÿe was a Belgian, of course. So why would he choose to write a Mazurka?
Yeah, this is a great question. The Polish music, first of all, had really infiltrated European culture already at that point. More the polonaises, perhaps, than the mazurkas. But of course, the mazurka was greatly popularized by Chopin and Wieniawski, of course. And these pieces were ideal as showpieces at a time when salon culture was really important. And in salon culture, basically, you had wealthy patrons running these salons. And the ideal kind of showpiece would be something about 4 to 6 minutes. And of course, to have something like a mazurka where the genre incorporates a very stark contrast between light and dark characters was an ideal vehicle. And in terms of why Ysaÿe would choose it, that's one practical reason. The other reason, most very likely, is that his two mentors, his two masters, were Violin and Wieniawski. And he has studied with Violin and Wieniawski. Wieniawski was still actually actively playing while he was studying with him. And I think you could say that it served as the perfect model to emulate and then also to bring his own voice into that genre. And I think it's quite important to note that it's his early works where he has this mazurka, and the later works start to shift away from this showpiece, salon piece structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It shifts into just longer works, or I know musically they get more and more, they sound more and more 20th century, or speak very broadly.
What I would argue is that his musical voice actually stays surprisingly consistent. Obviously, the way that he uses harmonies, the way that he plays around with structures, this adapts. And that's really to his great credit that he is very sensitive to the trends around him. He absorbs it and he brings it out in his own voice. So you see these early works, and then it moves on to, I guess he himself notes that the poème élégiaque is like this watershed moment where he really breaks free of that mold into a different kind of expression. And then he has the poems. He then, to simplify a little bit, he then reaches the apex of the six sonatas. And actually, even beyond that, he has a few works after the sonatas. And those actually point yet to another evolution. So if you listen to like his late trios, they are really wild. The language, the harmonic language is even more adventurous than what you find in these six sonatas. So, but as of, speaking violinist to violinist, I think we can feel in the hand, right? You feel in the hand, you feel in the arm, the way his passage work works. Mm-hmm. And you can still feel that there's this relationship, even if it's not, the same kind of harmony, is that there's this relationship in how the dynamics of your body works in like the Mazurka, and how it works in the six sonatas. There's this single line. It's not as if it's two different composers. It's the same composer who has evolved in the way he expresses his emotions and his thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. In general, I find his violin writing is wonderfully idiomatic. I find that the violin rings very nicely when he writes. And that's, you would think that any violinist composer would write in a way that just makes the instrument sound more glorious. But it's surprisingly not the case.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, even between the two mentors that you mentioned, Wieniawski and Vieuxtemps. Wieniawski, I don't know if I would say that it lies better at the fingers. That's maybe, right, yeah. But the violin rings more easily.
That's right, yeah.
When he writes.
Yeah, Wieniawski is definitely more the flamboyant one, right? And I think he really understands how to get the most dynamic sound, whereas Vieuxtemps actually is very much more the kind of the artist violinist. So since we're talking just a little bit about this, Vieuxtemps is in some ways the harder composer to play, right? I think, as a violinist, it's like, that if you don't actually play it well, it doesn't sound so good. Whereas in Wieniawski, it's like you have a lot of open strings. It rings a lot. It feels great, and and you can kind of push through, and it comes out beautifully. Vieuxtemps, if you're not very careful, you can end up chopping up what's supposed to be a long phrase. And actually, this is something I will tie it into Ysaÿe, because Ysaÿe, he says his mentors are Vieuxtemps and Wieniawski, and yet it's clear from his writings that of the two, Vieuxtemps was his ideal. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really important, because then you see he has these mazurkas, the way that he's playing around with how he's done the mazurkas, perhaps you can draw a line from Wieniawski, but the expression is actually a little bit not as bombastic as Wieniawski. It's actually probing a little bit more in the sense of like, what's the musical expression? And I think this was something that he was very conscious about, which is why I think the same mazurka, different flavor, and it's actually combining both the technical flamboyance of Wieniawski, but a little bit the introspectiveness that you might find in like Vieuxtemps. Yeah,
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I was wondering if some of it had to do also, he was, strongly associated also with Debussy during his lifetime, right? He played the quartet. Did he premiere it or just play it?
It was actually written for his quartet.
Yeah.
So the Ysaÿe quartet. So he premiered it. Debussy, and I should also mention Fauré and Franck, right? He actually was a person who traversed those circles. Perhaps they were not always like Debussy, Franck, and Fauré. Perhaps were not always the closest of friends, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
Debussy being particularly a kind of notorious, a little bit difficult person, right? And then there was that rift between Ysaÿe and Debussy too, which maybe we can speak of for a different day. But in terms of the language, for sure, Debussy. But I would also say from Fauré, he learns a lot too. And then from Franck, of course, the whole cyclical development idea, it pervades so much of his music as well as the music of his circle around him.
Mm-hmm.
That yeah, he's very influenced by it.
Yeah, and I was wondering, is the also the sense that they were both Belgians, if this sort of camaraderie,
Oh sure, yeah.
if it meant something to him to write in a style that's closer to a very well-known Belgian. Also, it sort of occurred to me because the piece that I will play next, the Chant d'hiver, because it has this poem printed in the score, which is in Walloon, so and not in French. So that sort of
Yes.
occurred to me, and I, for actually quite some time, couldn't find a person to who could translate it to me, and then we started speaking, and you did it.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Yeah. So this was very interesting, and actually, thanks for the opportunity to look into this, because I had known that the poem was there, but it wasn't something in particular that I spent a lot of time on before. So just a couple of things. Of course, for people listening to this, Ysaÿe, being born in Liège, he's Walloon. Yeah, and the Walloon language is actually distinct and not the same as French. So if you know French, a lot of the words sound very similar, but it's different. And what actually makes it a little bit difficult to translate Walloon is that there's no standardized spelling, right? There isn't a standardized spelling, so it kind of makes it difficult. You actually have to be someone Walloon to be able to understand and translate. But so after some research, asking some colleagues, we were able to find a nice French translation that was made by Paul Lafin of the Trianon Theater in Liège. It's like a Walloon theater in Liège. And to translate the French into English, the poem comes out roughly as everything seems sorrowful, everything seems to be crying. It snows and the snow piles against the houses. The wind howls. It seems I can no longer hear the song of the water stifled under the ice. Right. So this was written by Joseph Flint, who was a Walloon poet.
Okay.
Yeah. And apparently Ysaÿe took a strong liking to that poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually think that the music very much does sort of portray in sounds but both the general atmosphere of this poem and you know, I don't know if I would call it, you know, word painting, but like, or in sound, but there's definitely, you can hear the wind, the moans. And I wanted to ask you also about this very particular genre, I would call it maybe a tone poem for violin and orchestra.
Right.
And this is not something that's very, very common. There's basically only, well, up to then, I would say that the only well-known example is the chanson poem.
That's right.
Other than that, this doesn't quite exist, right? So, and he has quite a few of those. Right. So he was basically trying to start something new, you would say, or? Yes,
yeah. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the poem Elegiac, he was actually very conscious that it was a watershed moment. That was his first poem. And actually it happens in very close proximity, timeline-wise, with Chausson's poem. And of course, Chausson's poem was written for Ysaÿe, and Ysaÿe took a very strong hand in its formation. What was really desired here is that, of course, Ysaÿe was very conscious of the tradition that he came from. So Vieuxtemps, Wieniawski, they all wrote violin concertos, right? And he understood that the harmonic language was evolving, and along with that, that the form should evolve with the expression. And he was looking for what this would be. Basically a little bit freer form than the concerto, because as we know, the concerto has a long tradition, and obviously there are concertos in the 20th century too, and a lot of composers have found ways to be creative within the genre. But it really came very close from the predecessor model was basically you had the exposition and then like the solo introduction, solo exposition, and then the development recapitulation, and yay, you have the concerto. Vieuxtemps's Concerto No. 5 actually being one of the experimental formats, right? We're not going to talk about it, but of basically trying to envelop the concerto 3 movements into like one. And actually that starts to turn a little bit into the direction of what Ysaÿe is doing. The poem as a genre, the tone poem obviously was used in orchestral music, right? So Liszt wrote lots of tone poems, Richard Strauss, obviously, right? Around the same era, the same time, there are these great composers exploring this genre of a single movement work that's not so short, but not extraordinarily long, and with a format that is a little bit freer than a typical sonata allegro form. So I think Ysaÿe really took a liking to this format that he found, well, basically thought that was perfect as a vehicle for the kind of expression that he wanted. And so he wrote the poème elegiaque. He was collaborating with Chausson for the poem that we all know and love. And then from there, he kept working on this genre. So in total is like, I think 6 poems, right? Of which the Chant d'hiver, I think, is like the third one. I should know, but yeah. But it's like and there are poems after it as well. But it's, as a violinist composer, I think you are very right that he is really one of the few to really explore this genre, to make it something. And it's great that you're playing it because it really should be heard. I think the only difficulty, right, is like programming it.
Exactly.
Yeah, this has always been the challenge. It's just like if you play Chausson poem too, it's very difficult to say, what are you playing tonight? Chausson poem. And what else?
You have to
Chausson
add something.
poem, right? It's like,
exactly.
Yeah. So there's this practical element for the concert, but as a genre, it's fantastic.
I also wanted to ask you something about that probably concerns mostly our viewers in the US, because it's relatively little known that, or at least I didn't know until recently, that Ysaÿe was music director in Cincinnati.
That's right. Yeah.
The orchestra. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that period, because
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So he came over to the States on tour, and basically the war broke out, and he was kind of
First World War.
Yeah, and right, and then he was kind of stuck. That kind of puts it a little bit of negative light, perhaps, but there was that practical aspect to it too, and of course he was already, totally well-known superstar, and I think Cincinnati was very eager to have someone like Ysaÿe come and bring stature to both the city and the conservatory there in the symphony. So that's really how he came. And of course, he actually picked up quite a few American students here too. And some of them actually went to Belgium afterwards to continue studying with him. So yeah, it's a really interesting part of American history too, like American music history, that Ysaÿe had spent a lot of time in Cincinnati, really built up the musical scene there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is interesting. Did he pick up on anything? Did he write any compositions during his time in the US?
I think the one composition that stands out and is in some ways a little bit enigmatic is Exil. It's a piece for string orchestra, and I think just from the title you can read into what it means. Some people have read different angles into the title, but I think it is very apt that he's away from home. He is in exile, and it's a really beautiful piece. It really should be played more often, I think. That's one of the pieces that stands out. The other piece perhaps is Extase, was composed around the same period as well, the fourth poem. And that was, of the poems, that was also one of the more often played, more picked up by other violinists too at that period. We don't hear it very much today, but it's also a really wonderful piece.
Yeah. Okay. This more or less covers up what I wanted to talk about. Thank you so much.
No, it's really my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, for sharing all this knowledge. Yeah. I learned a lot.
And we're back. We'll play now Chant d'hiver, a winter song for you. As we mentioned in the talk with Ray, this is inspired by a poem about winter, and the poem mentions moans and wind and ice, and I think you'll hear all of them in the music portrayed in sound. The moans at the beginning and the end. In the middle there's quite a lot of windy passages, and then the ice is the harmonics in the end for the violin. I hope you will enjoy this, a very special piece. That was Chant by Ysaÿe. Thank you to Liza for playing, and thank you very much to Ray Iwazumi for sharing a lot of new information also for me. And thank you all very much for watching. See you next time.